So guys, let's start. So we're gonna do with the Spring core, what is Bean post processor, and then we'll move on to Spring AOP, how we can implement an advice. So we are left with only one concept in Spring core, that's like Bean post processor. So this is very much in line to your life cycle of Bean. So lastly we did the life cycle of Bean. So what was it all about? Init method and destroy method, I hope you can recall. Other than that, we also saw that application context will create the objects without you requesting for them. So constructors were executed, but Bean factory will only create the objects when you request for them, right? So that was the concept. So let's come back to our session number 2 of Spring Framework. So here we created various beans over here. So let me just comment out this. So consider that we got this guy called address over here. So there is a bean ID known as address, right? So for which we got various properties, and address.java over here is having address line, city, state, and zip code, etc., etc. So in my client class, so the Spring way of getting the data goes like you say context dot get the bean, and you will mention the reference of your address, that's like ADRS, and you can mention your address dot class, so you will get the address, and you say CISO of AD. Let's run the code and we'll see some output over here as in your address, right? Now what I am going to do is I am going to come in my constructor. So there is no constructor, let's create one. So you say CISO address object constructed. Now I'm going to say one more method, it's like my init, and my init executed, right? So this is what we'll be getting in case you put some init method, right? So here I'm going to say one init method. Let's say the init method goes like my init. So in case you want to have a destroy method, so you just do it by saying destroy method goes like my destroy, and here you can create one more method, my destroy. Let's run the code in the client. So now you will see that it's gonna say address object constructed and then my init executed. What I am going to do, I am going to create one more new class, and I am going to say that this is my my processor. It can be any name of your choice. So I have given the name as my processor. This guy implements bean post processor for the from my Spring core layer itself. It's gonna implement this bean post processor. It's an interface now. You click on this arrow and say no suggestions. Post process after initialization and post process before initialization. So there are two methods which we need to override over here. Or let's just override only one method. Alright. So there are two methods which we need to implement in your bean post processor. Example, One is the post process after initialization, one is post process before initialization. And if you see both the inputs over here, the first guy is object and the second guy is the string. So here I'll just say object is my obj and string is some str. So it's not mandatory to change the reference variable names, right? So if you want, you can do so. By default, it was arg0, arg1. I am going to return this reference variable obj in both the cases. And here I will just put one CISO statement, and I'm going to say post process after initialization, and I'm also going to print the str, right? So we'll see what it will give us. And here this is post process before initialization. What I did, I created one class over here that's like my processor, which implements bean post processor. And in my bean post processor over here, I got two methods, bean post process after initialization and before initialization. So both the methods are having this reference to the object and reference to the string over here, if you can see. Make sure that you return this guy in the end. In my XML file over here, you create one bean and you just mention the class, which is like your com.auribises.my processor. I want Spring framework to create the object of this class called my processor. Now come back to the client and try to run the code once again. So what you see now is that after your constructor is executed, you got post process before initialization, and you're also getting the name of your bean, right? ADRS. So it means that over here in my post process after initialization, this str is what? It is the name of your bean, right? So when I'm going to execute my code, now I can see before the execution of my init method, before initialization is executed, and after initialization is executed after the my init method. It means before you start using your object, so these are the sequence of callbacks which you can put on your object. Before you execute your real business logic, you can actually do a lot of things before your object is created in a proper way, right? So first of all, you can go with the constructor. Then you can come up with some post process before initialization. Then you can say my init, and then finally you got after initialization. This is a life cycle of your bean. So if you want to extend the life cycle of your bean, you can do it with the help of an API called bean post processor. So previously I got only two callbacks, constructor and init method. So now you can actually extend your life cycle of the bean by using your bean post processor. Now what can you do? So there can be various stages in which you want to authenticate or validate a user. For example, in the stage number 1, you want to say that user is going to enter login. Let's say login scenario. ID and password user is supposed to enter, and this is an encrypted data. So this encrypted data will be decrypted first, and then in the second layer I am going to check whether the username and password is correct, right? And then in the third layer I can access a role, whether this user is an admin or it's a manager or it's an employee. So you can have lot of sequential steps which you can perform before you use your object now, right? So these are the series of callbacks which you can receive as a life cycle of your object. Clear ji? So bean post processor is nothing, it's gonna give you the life cycle methods for your object. Now let's move to the next concept, which is Spring AOP. AOP stands for Aspect Oriented Programming. So what is AOP? It is Aspect Oriented Programming. Now in AOP or Aspect Oriented Programming, I say that there is a guy called cross-cutting concern. Now what is a cross-cutting concern? Let's see that. So if you see, there are three major layers. The first one is the presentation layer, which focuses on the UI part, the user interface part. Then you got a business layer, which will focus on your core business logic. When I say business logic, it means that you are going to resolve a problem. So you're writing a code over here which is going to resolve a problem. So a very simple business logic can be to save the user in the database. So that's a business logic now. So my business layer will focus on that. Presentation layer can be giving the user a form where user can enter the data. And data access layer, you are finally putting your data into an object, right? And you are writing some JDBC helper or Hibernate kind of a code, right? So data access layer. Security is one cross-cutting concern because this concern cannot be ignored on any layer. Are we getting now? So a cross-cutting concern is a concern which cannot be ignored on any of the layer. So in order to implement the cross-cutting concerns, we have to come up with something known as aspect-oriented programming. In aspect-oriented programming, we write logics to entertain cross-cutting concern. Right? We need to entertain our cross-cutting concerns, so we need to write the logics which are done with the help of a concept called advices. So there is one fundamental known as advice. So advice is an API as well. So you use advice so that we can write a cross-cutting concern. You can implement a cross-cutting concern with the help of advices. Let's see what are advices. Now advice is one API. So there is an advice known as MethodBeforeAdvice. If you can see over here on the left hand side, we got a guy called MethodBeforeAdvice. Then you got AfterAdvice, and then you got interceptors. So there are now various advices. So for example, MethodBeforeAdvice is one interface. Then you got MethodBeforeAdvice as the real class. Then similarly you got after returning advice, so on and so forth. Now these advices are required in our programs so that we can fulfill our cross-cutting concerns. So I will be using these advices and will be implementing. So guys, this is also an interface, not a class. This is also an interface. MethodBeforeAdvice is an interface over here as an API. Now what I am trying to do over here, let's say there is a scenario. Let's try to take up a scenario. So scenario is, we will start from the presentation part, from the client part. So you got a client over here. So client will send some request, right? So client has to send some request, and this request goes like to register a user. The request goes like to register a user. So before the user is registered, so before you register a user, you need to do something. You need to do something. And after the user is registered, you need to do something. Let's try to understand. The client has to send a request, which is like register user. And I need to ensure that if a user is supposed to register, before my business logic is executed, I must do something, and after my business logic, I must do something again. For an example, it can be when the user started the registration process, what is the time when he started the registration process? And what is the time when he ended the registration process? Now, why I need this data? Why I will need this data? I will need this data so that I can anytime calculate what is the time taken on my web application to register a user. Very basic information. Then there can be a request which goes like browse products. So it means that the user is going to browse my products in the application. Let's say typically is going to browse some iPhones. So I need to put something before my business logic starts and something again when my business logic is finished, right? So in starting, I will put a timestamp when he started browsing my products, and in the end, I will say when he finished browsing the products. So I will come to know that on which particular product the guy is spending what time, right? So other than that, what I can do, when the user is supposed to register himself, I can encrypt the data. I can encrypt the data. I can ensure that security is there. So before I register the user, I must be able to do something, and that can be either logging, 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 which means that I'm going to note a timestamp. Logging is like what I need to know a timestamp. तो मैं timestamp को कहीं ना कहीं save कर दूंगा. I will save the timestamp somewhere. The other part is like what? The other part is when your user is registered, then what? Sir, the data which was encrypted, that you can decrypt and then you can show it back to the user that these were the details with which I have registered you. And register user is typically going to work only and only on your encrypted data. So even register user method is not up to the mark that what is the kind of data which I am going to persist, right? Same goes with the browse products. Now this before and after concept is implemented with the help of a concept called advice, right? So what happens before your business method gets executed and after the business method is executed? You can do it with the help of advice. So in my aspect oriented programming, I got a fundamental called advice, which I am going to use now, right? So let's see how we can do that. So in my session number 2 itself, I'm going to create, I'm first of all going to link the jar files for my AOP. So session number 2 is already having the jar files for my Spring Core layer. So Spring Core jars are already there. So I will say a right click, build path, and you say configure the build path. And here you say add external jars. And we are going to add all the AOP jars, right? So here we are with the all AOP jars. So aspect oriented jar files are also now added. So if you want to use Spring Core, that's a different scenario. Spring AOP will focus on something different angle now. Spring Core, you need the core jar files, and Spring AOP, you need the AOP. But AOP will internally use Spring Core. So if you are going to perform AOP operation, aspect oriented programming, so within the aspect oriented programming, you need Spring Core itself. Without Spring Core, you cannot use AOP, right? So that's why we got both the jar files from the Spring Core as well as Spring AOP. Now you create one class over here. Let's say the class goes like one employee. So employee class is not there. Let's create one class employee. So employee can have one employee ID. Employee can have a name. Then there can be a method over here. So let's create the getter setter methods for this. So that's like the basic Spring way of doing the concept, right? So here we are, getters and setters. And you say source generate of a toString. Right, you got getter, setter and toString methods. Now over here, I am going to create one business method. You say public void register employee. You say register employee. Now this is a business method, right? So let's say this guy is a business method. Register employee. Now registration employee over here, you say CISO employee registration started, and the last statement goes like employer registration finished. So consider that your registration process might take somewhere around 2500 milliseconds, right? So I'm just going to make this thread to sleep for 2.5 seconds, 2.5 seconds. So consider that this time I'm just considering it's some database operation which will take 2.5 seconds. So let's consider some DB operation. For example, hibernate will take 2.5 seconds to save employee. So I'm not writing the code to save the employee, right? So here typically how you are going to save the employee in the database, that code goes here. So what will happen? Register employee method, when it is going to get executed, the registration process will start. So some code will be executed. I don't know how much time it's gonna take, so I'm going to take one fixed timestamp, that's like 2.5 seconds, right? And then you say employee registration is finished. What I want something should happen before this method and something should happen after this method. So there are two things now, right? So I am concerned about when my business logic starts, something should happen before and something should happen after. Now that's the crux, what I need to implement. To do that, let's create one class over here. Right click and say a new class. So you say BeforeAdvice. It can be any name of your choice. I'm keeping the name as BeforeAdvice. BeforeAdvice is going to implement an interface called MethodBeforeAdvice. So there is an interface called MethodBeforeAdvice, right? And click on this arrow and say add unimplemented methods. So before method is taking a method. So for example, this arg0, I'm just going to say it as method. So object array, you just say obj and let's say obj arr. It can be any name. You can take arg012 as per your preference and the obj part. We got BeforeAdvice, which implements method BeforeAdvice over here. Now you say CISO of method dot get the name. The method over here, I am just trying to print the name of the method. What is the method which will be executed? Then let's put a for loop for object O in obj arr. So what and all is there? So I will print out that. I will say CISO of O. And lastly, I am going to just print out this guy obj over here. So I am printing three things. I am doing nothing over here. So there is a method called before in which the inputs are there and I am just printing out the inputs. And one more thing which I can put is just one CISO statement which goes like before executed, right? Here you are. So there is a class called BeforeAdvice which implements a method BeforeAdvice and मैंने before method की inputs को क्या कर दिया? I have just printed everything. I am not using them. I am just printing them. Similar to the BeforeAdvice, I got one more class which I want to create and I am going to name it like AfterAdvice. So AfterAdvice is also going to implement after returning advice. So let's say after returning advice. If you can see, these are from the AOP, Spring Frameworks AOP package. Both the guys are from AOP, Aspect Oriented Programming. Click on it and say add unimplemented methods. Here we are. The way you got your BeforeAdvice having the inputs, in a similar way we got AfterAdvice having some inputs. So it is having some more inputs. So let's try to print them. So let's give it the name as obj and let's say obj1 I'm going to say its method, it's obj arr, and this is your obj2. Let's print out them and let's see what will happen. So here we are. So after executed, method dot get the name, obj arr we are printing. Let's print obj1 as well as obj2. Let's see what we have done. We created a class called employee, right, with the getter and setters. Then we got one business method in the employee class where we got the employee registration started and employee registration finished. So this might take some time, so I am just going to put it like it's gonna take somewhere around 2.5 milliseconds. That's what I am going to do over here. So I'm just assuming that a registration process will take 2.5 seconds of time. Before advice is implementing method before advice, and after advice is implementing after returning advice. Good to go. And whatsoever is there in the after returning method and before method, I am just printing that. I am doing nothing. No business logic which I have put over here as of now. Let's come back to the XML file. And let us configure some data. You say bean m class goes like com.auribises.employee, right? And in the employee part you got two properties, EID and ename. So you say EID and ename 101, and let's say John Watson. I think we are done with this bean. So we got two more guys, before advice and after advice. Two classes are, right? So we need to implement them as well. So you got bean ID, let's say before advice, and here you go like before advice. So there are no properties in before advice. If you can see, there are no attributes. You need not to put anything. So I just finished it over here. In a similar way, I got one more guy called after advice. So what I did, I actually mapped my employee before advice and after advice in my XML file. So that's like the Spring way of doing it. You create the classes, but you don't create the objects. You configure the objects in the XML file. I configured 3 objects. One for the employee, one for the before advice, and last one for the after advice. Anyone having any query till now? Are we all good to go? Sure guys? Great. Now coming back to the client over here, let's say client.java. I'm going to write one API called Proxy Factory Bean. If you can see this Proxy Factory Bean, there is one API. This is an API, Proxy Factory Bean, and this API belongs to this AOP package, right? This is a Bani Banai class, Proxy Factory Bean in the AOP, Spring AOP. What I am going to do, I am going to come in my XML file over here, and I will now write the configuration of a predefined class in my XML file. So usually what you will do, usually you will write the configuration of your classes in the XML file. Now I am going to write the configuration of Proxy Factory Bean in my XML file. Let's see how we can do that. So you start in this manner. You got a Proxy Factory Bean class. So I am going to say it's a Stu Proxy. It can be any name, but the class over here, this goes like a very big name. So this is your org.spring framework. So this goes like my class. So usually you will write your own classes over here, but this time you are writing a predefined class called Proxy Factory Bean. In the proxy factory bean, you got this ID as 2 proxy. It can be any ID, but the class name is fixed. Now what is next? There is a property name known as target. So there is a class called proxy factory bean. In the proxy factory bean, there is a property called target, in which I am going to say there is a reference called employee. So guys, what is this instruction telling us? ये instruction क्या चीज है? We studied a concept called injection, dependency injection. Is it looking like that? So which injection it is? Constructor or setter? It's a setter injection, right? So what is happening? So in my class proxy factory bean, there is an attribute called target, which is going to take reference for this employee. Second thing is, I got one more property, interceptor names. The second property is interceptor names. Proxy factory bean is a predefined class for which I am configuring the object in XML file. And this property over here, it's gonna contain one list having the values before advice and after advice. ये वाली कौन सी डिपेंडेंसी इंजेक्शन है जी? व्हाट इज दिस डिपेंडेंसी इंजेक्शन? One to many, it's a collections based DI. So the first property over here is a setter injection, and the second property is your collections based dependency injection. One to many relationship. So what are the interceptor names like? It's like before advice and the after advice. So this is the complete configuration as of now. Please have a look. You got an employee class with a business method. You got before advice, you got after advice, and finally I got one API called proxy factory bean. So I just wrote it so that I can get its package name, right? So मैंने इसको क्यों लिखा? So that I can get its entire package name over here, right? So once I got the package name, I mentioned it over here. So this variable name can be any name of your choice. Proxy factory bean has two properties. The first is the target, in which you are going to give the reference of employee, and the second one is the interceptor names. So that is like your before advice and after advice. Let's come to the client now. So I said that I am going to create one scenario. Client will send some request, for example, register user or browse products, right? So we are now going to come in the client. So this is my client part with the main method where the client can write some instructions. So here you say context dot get the bean. So I am mentioning m proxy. Now what is m proxy? M proxy, sorry, stu proxy. So let's say stu proxy. So stu proxy over here is the ID of this proxy factory bean class, right? But I am going to do something different over here. I am going to say this, I am going to get my employee. So you say employee m as in context dot, sorry, student. My bad. यार हमने employee बनाया ना? Yeah, I got confused, right? So this is m proxy, okay? So here we are, m proxy. Now what I am going to do, I am just going to say m dot register the employee. So I got first of all the reference to the employee object, but I am getting it through employee proxy. Now let's run the code and just see what will happen, right? So one more thing which I am going to put is a CISO statement over here. So this goes like some stars. So it's like in the end of before advice and after advice, right? So we are just printing out the stars. Let's run the code over here. What can you see now? Before executed, so before your register employee method is executed, another guy is getting executed before executed. Then it is giving me the name of the method, register employee, which method name is executed, right? Then it is giving me the data in the object, because my printing of this guy in the before advice over here. So this is giving me the method name. So I can now say method name. So this is unexplored. This is not known as of now, right? So this is not known as of now. So what are these inputs to the method? These are inputs to the method. And what is last guy? Reference to the object. So if you run the code now, you understand that the first guy is before execution, then the method name is coming up, and then the data in the employee object is coming up. And then this is finished. Then your employee registration started, employee registration finished after 2.5 seconds. And thereafter what I am doing is I am able to see my after execution happened. So something is happening before my logic gets executed, and something is happening after my logic gets. This is the core fundamental which Amazon will use. If you're going to browse a product, so it's gonna note the timestamps. It's gonna note the timestamps. How much time you are going to give it to the product, right? So let's see that. So you say before advice, you say a CISO over here. So I'm going to print the java.util date over here. If you can see, it's a java.util.date API. So let's come and run the code now. So this is my before timestamp, right? 13:37:10, and this is your after timestamp 13:37:12. It means that we can come to know that user is spending approximately 2 seconds for my registration process. One of the concern which I have implemented, right? One of the concern, you can encrypt the data before or decrypt the data before, and then you can again encrypt and decrypt. So we got two of the fundamentals. One which runs before your method, other which runs after your method, right? So your concerns are implemented in this way with the help of advices. So in my registration process, let's try to give some inputs. So this is my employee class. I'm going to say that it is having two inputs. One is the name, and let's say one is the ID. So I'm just going to give the two inputs, ID and name. I'm not using it. So in my client, let's say ID is 101, let's say 105, and name is Jack JJ. You run the code now, and now what you find is that your before execution is giving you the inputs even. It means that before your method is executed, you can process the inputs, and after your method is executed, you can process the inputs again, right? So what we can do, we can actually use the data which is given to the method before that method is executed, and you can do something of yourself. So previously, with the help of bean post processor, you came up with the life cycle of the bean, right? What is the life cycle of the bean? Then using the aspect oriented programming, you are able to create kind of a life cycle of a method. What happens before the method is executed and what happens after the method is finished its execution, right? So that's like your aspect oriented programming in the Spring framework. So you are getting some null, right? So I think it's gonna be your obj3, obj2 I mean over here. So this guy is coming out to be null. I need to read out the documentation what exactly it is. Okay, so here you are, obj1 is null, right? So obj2 is the entire reference. So if you are having a reference to your object, right, you can manipulate the data. So it means in your before advice or in your after advice, you can actually manipulate the data from here, right? So you can say student S is student from obj2, and then you can just say S dot, sorry, I'm so sorry, employee E is employee, and then you can say E dot EID. You can just play around with the data, right? So you got the E dot EID. What you can do, you can just encrypt the data, right? You got E dot name. So you're able to access the data, right? So E dot, so you can have int ID and string of some name. So what you can do, play with data or just do an encryption here. And decryption goes like in your, so here it can be I think decryption because it's after advice, right? So encryption or decryption, whatever. Right, so when the flight will start up, so you can note down the initial stamps. So there will be various processes which are supposed to happen in the software system. You're gonna start the engine of the flight, so there has to be some software elements which will come into action. So what happens before the core business method is executed, what happens after the business method is executed, right? So this is known as aspect oriented programming in the Spring framework, which goes with the help of your advices, right? So we got before advice and we got something known as after advice, as in after returning advice, and method before advice. To implement the advices, you must link your reference with the proxy factory bean and ensure that in your client part you are getting the bean for the proxy, not the employee, right? So this goes like your aspect oriented programming, guys. Any queries and any concerns over here? What is AOP? Done? Great.